The autumn sun was setting as James Richardson carefully adjusted his rearview mirror. At 72 years old, he still maintained the precise habits formed during his 30 years of military service. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and memories, gripped the steering wheel of his well-maintained Mercedes E-Class at the perfect 10 and 2 position. Every Wednesday afternoon, without fail, James made this drive home from the Veterans Support Center where he volunteered. Today had been particularly rewarding. He helped 3 young veterans secure job interviews and assisted another with his housing application. The satisfaction of continuing to serve, even in retirement, always brought a gentle smile to his face. The Mercedes purred smoothly as it cruised through the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights, an upscale suburb where James had lived for the past 25 years. His house was one of the first built in the development, purchased with savings and smart investments from his military career. The car itself was a retirement gift from his children, all 3 successful professionals who insisted their father deserved something special after a lifetime of service. Looking every bit the distinguished gentleman he was, James wore a crisp blue button-down shirt and pressed khaki slacks. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his military posture remained perfect even after all these years. A small Air Force pin gleamed on his collar, and his license plate proudly displayed his veteran status. The rear window carried 2 stickers, one for the Air Force and another showing his status as a retired colonel. As he drove, James reflected on his journey. Born in rural Georgia during the time of segregation, he worked his way through college, earned his commission, and flew combat missions in Vietnam. Through determination and excellence, he rose through the ranks, eventually commanding his own squadron during Operation Desert Storm. Now, decades later, he still worked tirelessly to help fellow veterans navigate civilian life. The streets were quiet this evening, with only a few dog walkers and joggers out enjoying the pleasant weather. James waved to Mrs. Peterson, who was tending to her roses. She'd been a neighbor for over 2 decades, and her late husband had also been a veteran. A few houses down, he noticed the Thompsons had finally finished painting their fence, the one topic of discussion at last month's neighborhood association meeting. Inside his car, soft jazz played from the radio, Miles Davis, his favorite for evening drives. The leather seats were comfortable, though James had added a small cushion for his back. On the passenger seat lay a folder containing the day's paperwork from the support center, along with a small box of cookies that Mary, one of the center's volunteers, had baked for him. James checked his watch. 5:45 p.m., right on schedule as always. His wife Catherine would have dinner ready by 6:30, giving him plenty of time to arrive home, change, and help set the table. Wednesday nights were special. Catherine always made his favorite cornbread, a recipe passed down from his mother. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, just 2 streets from home, James noticed a police cruiser parked under a large oak tree. He didn't recognize the officer inside. Must be someone new to the force. James knew most of the local police, having worked with them on various veteran outreach programs over the years. The setting sun caught his rearview mirror, momentarily blinding him. James adjusted it again, his movements deliberate and practiced. The American flag hanging from the Andersons' porch fluttered in the evening breeze, reminding him of morning colors on base. Some habits and memories never fade, no matter how many years pass. He was looking forward to getting home. Catherine had mentioned their grandson Tommy would call tonight to share news about his college applications. At 17, Tommy wanted to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and attend the Air Force Academy. The thought filled James with pride, though he was careful not to push. He wanted Tommy to make his own choices, just as he had. Little did James know that his peaceful evening routine was about to be dramatically interrupted. The police cruiser he'd passed was now pulling out from its spot, lights suddenly flashing in his rearview mirror. As he guided his Mercedes to the curb, James had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would spark a controversy that would ripple through their quiet community and beyond. James Richardson carefully pulled his Mercedes to the curb, positioning it perfectly as he had done countless times during his military career. He switched off the jazz music and placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible to whoever was approaching. Years of experience had taught him how to handle these situations. Stay calm, be respectful, but maintain your dignity. Officer Michael Brooks emerged from his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he walked toward the Mercedes. At 29 years old, Brooks was relatively new to the force, having served just 3 years in this wealthy suburb. He approached with his hand resting near his weapon, flashlight beam dancing across the luxury car's polished surface. License and registration, Brooks barked, not even waiting to reach the driver's window. His tone was sharp, dismissive, lacking the professional courtesy typically expected from law enforcement. The beam of his flashlight moved directly to James's face, held there longer than necessary. James spoke softly but clearly, "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" His hands remained visible on the steering wheel, his military training evident in his composed demeanor. The Mercedes's interior light illuminated his neat appearance and the Air Force pin on his collar. Officer Brooks' response came with a sneer. "You look pretty suspicious driving this kind of car in this neighborhood. Where'd you get it?" The question was loaded with assumptions, each word dripping with prejudice. He deliberately ignored the military veteran license plate and the Air Force stickers clearly visible on the vehicle. "Sir, I live just 2 streets over on Oak Lane. I'm returning from the Veterans Support Center where I volunteer," James explained patiently, reaching slowly for his wallet. "I'm going to get my license now, if that's all right." "Yeah, right," Brooks scoffed. "And I'm the President of the United States." He watched with obvious skepticism as James produced his driver's license, registration, and military ID, all organized perfectly in his wallet. The officer snatched the documents roughly, studying them under his flashlight. His expression shifted between disbelief and dismissal. "These look fake to me," he declared, despite the clearly official documents. "Step out of the vehicle." James felt a familiar weight in his chest, not fear, but a deep disappointment. After serving his country for 3 decades, after rising to the rank of colonel, after helping countless veterans rebuild their lives, he was still facing this kind of treatment. Yet his voice remained steady. "Officer, I provided valid identification. There's no reason for me to exit my vehicle." Brooks's face reddened. "Listen here, old man, I don't care what fake IDs you've got. No way this is your car. Now get out before I make you get out." His hand moved more deliberately toward his weapon, a threatening gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The evening had grown darker, but porch lights were beginning to flip on along the street. Curtains moved in nearby windows as neighbors noticed the confrontation unfolding. A few people had emerged onto their front steps, phones in hand, recording the scene. James took a deep breath, remembering similar moments throughout his life. Moments when he had to choose between standing up for his rights and submitting to avoid escalation. He thought of his grandson Tommy, who might face similar situations in his future. What example should he set? "Officer Brooks," James said, reading the nameplate on the officer's uniform, "I understand you're doing your job, but your current behavior is unprofessional and possibly discriminatory. I'd like to speak with your supervising officer." This seemed to enrage Brooks further. "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" he spat. "Get out of the car, now." His voice had risen to a shout, echoing down the quiet suburban street. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Sarah Chen, a local news reporter who lived 3 doors down. She recognized James immediately. She had interviewed him just last month about his veteran support programs. As the situation teetered on the edge of escalation, James remained steady, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. His military training had taught him to handle crisis situations, but it pained him deeply that he needed to use those skills here, in his own neighborhood, simply for driving his own car home. The red and blue lights continued to flash, casting alternating shadows across the scene, as this moment of casual prejudice was about to transform into something much larger than Officer Brooks could have anticipated. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Brooks circled James's Mercedes like a predator, his flashlight beam cutting through the evening darkness. James remained seated, his dignified posture unchanged, though his heart ached at the injustice unfolding. "Last warning," Brooks shouted, rapping his knuckles against the driver's window. "Get out of the vehicle, or I'll have to remove you myself." His face was twisted with anger, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. The body camera on his uniform blinked silently, recording every word and action. James slowly pressed the button to lower his window fully. "Officer Brooks," he spoke clearly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded hundreds of troops. "I want to point out that your body camera is recording this interaction. I am a 72-year-old disabled veteran, and you have shown no cause for this stop. Brooks's face flushed red with rage. Oh, so now you're threatening me with my own camera. He leaned into the window, his breath fogging the glass. I don't care if you claim to be a veteran. For all I know, you stole those military IDs along with this car. Sarah Chen, the reporter, had moved closer, her phone steadily recording the scene. Other neighbors had formed a loose semicircle around the Mercedes, their presence both witnessing and documenting the unfolding situation. Mrs. Peterson, still in her gardening gloves, stood with her mouth open in shock. Young man, James said, his voice remaining calm but firm, I flew combat missions in Vietnam when your parents were probably children. I commanded a squadron in Desert Storm. And now I help homeless veterans rebuild their lives. That's not a claim. That's my life's work. Brooks sneered. Yeah? And I'm the Queen of England. Step out now, or I'm calling for backup. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking with poorly controlled anger. James carefully unfastened his seatbelt. At his age, sudden movements weren't just unwise, they were uncomfortable. I will step out, he said, but I want everyone present to witness that I'm complying under protest, and that no probable cause has been established for this stop. As James slowly opened his door, his military bearing was evident in every movement. He stood to his full height, and even at 72, there was something imposing about his presence. His pressed clothes, perfect posture, and dignified demeanor contrasted sharply with Brooks's increasingly unprofessional behavior. Hands where I can see them, Brooks barked, though James's hands were already visible. Turn around, spread your legs. Each command was delivered with unnecessary aggression, as if he were dealing with a dangerous criminal rather than an elderly veteran. The growing crowd of neighbors murmured in disapproval. Someone called out, That's Colonel Richardson. He serves on the Governor's Veterans Committee. Another voice added, He's lived here longer than you've been alive, officer. Brooks seemed to falter for a moment, but his pride pushed him forward. Quiet, all of you. This is a police matter. He moved behind James, roughly patting down the elderly man's legs and sides. James winced as the officer's aggressive movements aggravated his old war injury, but he remained silent. His mind flashed back to other moments of discrimination he'd faced, as a young airman, as a rising officer, and now as a retired veteran. Each time, he'd chosen to maintain his dignity, to be an example. The search, of course, revealed nothing suspicious, just a wallet, a phone, and a small box of cookies from the Veterans Center. Brooks held up the cookie box suspiciously. What's in here? Could be drugs. Those are Mary's chocolate chip cookies, James replied evenly. She bakes them every Wednesday for our veterans support group. You're welcome to inspect them, Officer Brooks. Sarah Chen had moved even closer, her journalist's instincts telling her this story was about to become much bigger than a routine traffic stop. She noticed another police car turning onto the street. This one moving at a casual pace, its lights off. James noticed it too. Through the years, he'd learned that sometimes justice required patience. As the new police car pulled up slowly, its headlights illuminating the growing scene. By now, at least 30 neighbors had gathered on the quiet suburban street, their phones raised like glowing fireflies in the darkening evening. The atmosphere was charged with tension and disbelief. Sarah Chen, the local news reporter, had switched from her phone to her professional camera, which she always kept in her car for breaking stories. She moved through the crowd, capturing different angles of the confrontation while speaking quietly into her recorder. Decorated Air Force veteran Colonel James Richardson, age 72, being detained without cause in front of his own home. Mrs. Peterson, still wearing her gardening gloves, had tears in her eyes as she spoke to other neighbors. I've known James and Catherine for 25 years, she said, her voice trembling. He helped my Harold get his veterans' benefits before he passed. This is absolutely shameful. Officer Brooks continued his aggressive stance, seemingly oblivious to the gathering witnesses. He was still holding the box of cookies, examining it as if it contained contraband. Who baked these? He demanded, shaking the box. I need the full name and address of this Mary person. James stood patiently, his back straight despite the discomfort of his old injury. Mary Thompson, officer. She's the widow of Captain David Thompson, U.S. Marines. She volunteers at our Veterans Center every Wednesday. His voice carried clearly through the evening air, dignified and composed. The crowd had grown larger still. Tom Martinez, who owned the local hardware store, pushed his way forward. "I served under Colonel Richardson in Desert Storm," he called out. "This man is a hero. What are you doing, officer?" Brooks spun around, startled by the direct challenge. "Stay back. This is a police matter." His voice had taken on a slightly panicked edge as he realized how many witnesses were present. From the gathering emerged David Chen, Sarah's 16-year-old son, who had been recording everything on his social media live stream. "We're already at 5,000 viewers," he announced to no one in particular. "The comments are blowing up." The scene had taken on an almost surreal quality. Porch lights cast long shadows across manicured lawns. More cars were slowing down as they passed, some stopping completely. A few people had brought out lawn chairs, sensing this confrontation wouldn't end quickly. Catherine Richardson, James's wife of 45 years, emerged from their house 2 doors down. She had heard the commotion and come to investigate. Her appearance caused another stir in the crowd. Dressed in her nurse's scrubs from her volunteer work at the VA hospital, she carried herself with the same dignity as her husband. "James?" she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What's happening here?" Before James could answer, Officer Brooks intercepted her. "Ma'am, stay back. This is an ongoing investigation." The crowd's reaction was immediate and vocal. "Investigation of what?" someone shouted. "Driving while black?" called another voice. "He's lived here longer than you've had a badge," added a third. Sarah Chen had positioned herself strategically, capturing both the officer's increasingly flustered expression and the growing crowd of outraged neighbors. Her years of journalistic experience told her this story would make headlines beyond their local news. "I'm watching this live from Chicago," someone in the crowd read from their phone. "It's trending." The power of social media was turning this neighborhood incident into a viral moment. Judge Marcus Wilson, who lived across the street, emerged from his house in his casual evening wear. A respected figure in the community, he moved purposefully toward the scene. "Officer," he called out, his judicial authority evident in his voice, "I believe you need to carefully reconsider your actions." The second police car's door finally opened, and a figure stepped out. The crowd hushed slightly, anticipating what would happen next. Officer Brooks, still holding the box of cookies and standing next to James, hadn't noticed the new arrival. In the strange quiet that followed, the only sounds were the chirping of evening crickets and the soft hum of dozens of phones recording what was about to become a pivotal moment in their community's history. Captain Sandra Martinez stepped out of the second police car, her silver bars gleaming under the streetlights. At 48, she was one of the most respected officers in the department, known for her fairness and 20-year service record. More importantly, she had worked with Colonel Richardson on numerous veteran support programs. "Officer Brooks," her voice cut through the evening air like a knife. "What exactly is going on here?" Brooks turned, still holding the box of cookies, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and growing uncertainty. "Captain, I've got a suspicious subject in a vehicle that's too expensive for—" He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware of how his words would sound. Captain Martinez's expression hardened. "Too expensive for what, Officer Brooks?" Her boots clicked against the pavement as she approached, each step deliberate and purposeful. The crowd had fallen completely silent, phones still recording every moment. I mean, he couldn't provide a reasonable explanation for," Brooks stammered. The Martinez cut him off with a raised hand. She turned to James, her entire demeanor changing. "Colonel Richardson, sir, I apologize for this situation." She snapped to attention and saluted crisply, a gesture that spoke volumes to everyone watching. The crowd murmured as Martinez continued, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "Officer Brooks, do you know who this man is?" Without waiting for an answer, she pressed on. "You're currently harassing Colonel James Richardson, recipient of the Silver Star, 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and most recently, the Presidential Citizens Medal." Brooks's face drained of color. The box of cookies trembled slightly in his hands. "Colonel Richardson," Martinez continued, "commanded the 47th Tactical Fighter Squadron during Desert Storm. He's currently the chairman of our State Veterans Affairs Board and a personal advisor to the governor on veterans issues. She took a step closer to Brooks. He's also the man who established our department's Veteran Crisis Response Program, the same program that's mandatory training for all officers, including you, Officer Brooks. Sarah Chen's camera captured the exact moment realization dawned on Brooks's face. His mouth opened and closed without forming words. Furthermore, Martinez added, her voice growing even more stern, Colonel Richardson was just returning from the Veterans Support Center, where he volunteers every Wednesday, helping homeless veterans reintegrate into society. The same center where my own father, a Vietnam veteran, got help when he was struggling. The crowd had grown larger still. Some were wiping tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Catherine Richardson had made her way to her husband's side, taking his arm supportively. And those cookies you're treating like contraband. Martinez pointed to the box in Brooks's hands. They're made by Mary Thompson, whose husband died saving 3 fellow Marines. She bakes them every week for the Veterans Support Group. Brooks looked down at the cookie box as if it had suddenly burned his hands. His face had shifted from pale to bright red. Sir, Martinez addressed James directly. Would you like to press charges for harassment or civil rights violations? James straightened his collar, still maintaining his dignified bearing. No, Captain, he replied, his voice firm but compassionate. What I'd like is for this to become a teaching moment. He turned to Brooks. Officer, I've spent my life serving this country and helping others understand the importance of respect, dignity, and fairness. Perhaps we can turn this unfortunate incident into something positive. The silence that followed was profound. Even the crickets seemed to pause their evening song. Judge Wilson stepped forward from the crowd. Colonel Richardson is right. This needs to be a moment of learning, not punishment. He looked pointedly at Brooks, though I expect this will be addressed appropriately through proper channels. Captain Martinez nodded. Officer Brooks, return to the station immediately. We'll discuss this incident in detail with the chief. Her tone left no room for argument. As Brooks walked back to his patrol car, shoulders slumped in shame, the crowd began to disperse. But something had changed in the neighborhood that evening. What started as an act of prejudice had transformed into a powerful reminder of human dignity and the importance of looking beyond surface judgments. Sarah Chen closed her camera as the scene wound down, knowing she had captured a moment that would resonate far beyond their suburban street. A story about prejudice, respect, and the unexpected ways wisdom can emerge from injustice. The following morning, the police station's conference room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Chief Robert Williams sat at the head of the table, his face stern as he reviewed the footage from Officer Brooks's body camera for the 3rd time. Captain Martinez stood by the window, while Brooks sat alone on one side, looking like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Over 30 years in law enforcement, Chief Williams finally spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment, and this is one of the most embarrassing incidents I've ever had to address. He placed his reading glasses on the table and rubbed his temples. The door opened, and to everyone's surprise, Colonel Richardson walked in, accompanied by Judge Wilson and Sarah Chen. The story had exploded overnight. Sarah's report had gone viral, and national news networks were already requesting interviews. Colonel Richardson, Chief Williams stood quickly, extending his hand. I can't express how deeply sorry we are for last night's incident. The chief's usual commanding presence was tempered by genuine remorse. James raised his hand. Chief, I didn't come here for apologies. I came here with a proposal. He placed a folder on the conference table. Last night showed us that we still have work to do in building bridges between law enforcement and our community. Officer Brooks, who hadn't been able to look up since James entered, finally raised his eyes. The shame on his face was evident, but there was also confusion about why the man he had humiliated would return here voluntarily. Young man, James addressed Brooks directly. How much do you know about the civil rights movement? About the veterans who fought overseas for freedom, only to face discrimination at home? Brooks swallowed hard. Sir, I took the required history courses at the academy, but his voice trailed off, understanding how shallow that answer sounded. James nodded thoughtfully. Captain Martinez tells me you were a good student at the academy, top of your class in tactical training. He opened the folder, but somewhere along the way, you forgot the most important part of your job, serving and protecting all citizens equally. Sarah Chen's pen moved rapidly across her notepad as James continued. I'm proposing a new training program, not just about policies and procedures, but about real experiences, about the veterans of color who served this country, about the struggles they faced and still face. Judge Wilson stepped forward. I've reviewed the Colonel's proposal. It's comprehensive, combining historical education with community engagement. Officers would spend time at the Veterans Support Center, hearing real stories, understanding real experiences. Captain Martinez moved to the center of the room, and Colonel Richardson has agreed to lead this program personally. She looked pointedly at Brooks. Starting with Officer Brooks, if he's willing to learn. Brooks's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Sir, he addressed James. After what I did, you'd be willing to teach me. James smiled gently. Son, in Vietnam, I learned that the best way to defeat prejudice is not through punishment, but through understanding. You're not the first person to judge me by my skin color, and sadly, you probably won't be the last. But you have an opportunity here to learn, to grow, and to help others avoid making the same mistakes. Chief Williams was already nodding. This is exactly what our department needs. Colonel, we would be honored to implement your program. The tension in the room began to shift into something else, hope, perhaps, or the possibility of real change. Officer Brooks, James said, would you be willing to share your experience with other officers? To talk about what you learned from this incident? Brooks stood up, his posture straightening. Yes, sir, I would. His voice cracked slightly. I've never been so wrong about anyone in my life. I've never been more ashamed of my actions. Sarah's article would later describe this moment as a masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. National police departments would soon request copies of what would become known as the Richardson Protocol. As the meeting concluded, James paused at the door. Officer Brooks, those cookies you were so suspicious of. Mary bakes them fresh every Wednesday. He smiled. Next week, why don't you come to the center and try them yourself? While you're there, you might hear some stories that will change your perspective forever. The young officer nodded, a glimmer of understanding finally showing in his eyes. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the most humble packages, even a simple box of cookies. 1 week after the incident, the Veterans Support Center buzzed with unusual activity. The small brick building, usually quiet except for Wednesday afternoons, was packed with news crews, community members, and curious onlookers. Inside, Mary Thompson was arranging her fresh-baked cookies on a paper plate, her hands trembling slightly from all the attention. James Richardson stood at the podium, his military bearing unchanged despite the cameras flashing around him. National news networks had picked up Sarah Chen's story, turning the local incident into a nationwide conversation about respect, prejudice, and the possibility of positive change. What happened last week could have ended very differently. James began, his voice clear and steady. Instead of anger, we chose understanding. Instead of punishment, we chose education. He gestured to Officer Brooks, who sat in the front row, looking both nervous and determined in his civilian clothes. The young officer had spent the past week in deep reflection. His fellow officers had been divided in their reactions. Some distanced themselves, while others admitted they could have made the same mistakes. The video of the incident had become required viewing at the police academy, though Brooks himself could barely watch it without cringing. Catherine Richardson, standing beside her husband, squeezed his hand as he continued speaking. Today, we're launching the Community Bridge program. It's not just about police training. It's about bringing people together, sharing stories, and understanding each other's experiences. Sarah Chen's camera focused on the diverse crowd. Veterans of different ages, races, and backgrounds filled the room. Some wore their old service caps, others came in business suits or work clothes. All were there to support what local papers had started calling the Richardson Initiative. Officer Brooks, James called out, would you like to share your thoughts? Brooks stood slowly, his face flushed but determined. A week ago, I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer, he began, his voice shaky. I had the highest scores at the academy. I knew all the procedures, but I didn't know about Colonel Richardson flying combat missions while facing discrimination at home. I didn't know about Mary Thompson's husband sacrificing his life for his fellow Marines. He paused, looking around the room, I didn't know because I never bothered to learn. I let my prejudices blind me, and in doing so, I dishonored both my badge and the veterans who served this country. Mary Thompson approached Brooks with her plate of cookies, her kind smile bringing tears to his eyes. We all make mistakes, young man, she said softly. It's what we learn from them that matters. Chief Williams stepped forward next, holding an official-looking document. Starting today, the Richardson Protocol becomes mandatory training for all officers in our department. 6 other police departments have already requested to implement the program. The announcement drew applause, but James raised his hand for quiet. This is just the beginning, he said. Real change happens person by person, story by story. Officer Brooks will be our first graduate, but he won't be our last. As if to prove his point, 3 more young officers entered the center, having come straight from their shift. They wore uncertain expressions, but Mary immediately welcomed them with cookies and coffee. Sarah Chen, who had followed the story from the beginning, watched as Brooks introduced himself to an elderly Vietnam veteran. The officer sat down, took out a notebook, and began to listen. Real listening, the kind that changes hearts and minds. Colonel, she called out, your story has reached millions. What do you hope people will learn from it? James looked around the room, at Brooks earnestly taking notes, at Mary sharing her cookies, at the mix of uniforms and civilian clothes, at the barriers slowly coming down. I hope they learn that it's never too late to build bridges, that every mistake can become a stepping stone toward understanding. Catherine smiled proudly at her husband. After 45 years of marriage, she was still amazed by his ability to transform difficult situations into opportunities for growth. As the afternoon continued, more people arrived, curious neighbors, other police officers, community leaders. The small Veterans Support Center became what it was always meant to be, a place of healing, learning, and connection. Outside, the media trucks continued to broadcast, spreading the story across the nation. But the real story was happening inside, where cookies were shared, stories were told, and bridges were built. One conversation at a time. 3 months after the incident, the police department's largest training room was transformed. Photos of veterans from different eras lined the walls, their stories printed beneath each image. At the center stood Officer Michael Brooks, no longer the angry young policeman who had harassed James Richardson. Before we start today's training, Brooks addressed the room full of fellow officers. I want you to look at these photos. Each one tells a story I was too blind to see that night. His voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The audience included officers from 12 different police departments across the state. The Richardson Protocol had gained national attention, and departments nationwide were sending representatives to learn about its implementation. Sarah Chen sat in the back, working on her follow-up article. Her original story had won her a regional journalism award, but she felt the real story was just beginning to unfold. 3 months ago, Brooks continued, pointing to his body camera footage playing on the screen. I was that officer. Arrogant, prejudiced, and completely wrong. The footage showed his confrontation with James, causing several officers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. James Richardson entered the room quietly, accompanied by Captain Martinez. He walked with the same dignity he'd shown that night, but now his presence drew respect rather than suspicion. The room stood at attention. At ease, James said with a gentle smile, Today isn't about protocol or rank, it's about understanding. He moved to stand beside Brooks, a gesture that spoke volumes about forgiveness and growth. Officer Brooks has completed our intensive 8-week program, James announced. He spent time with veterans from every conflict since World War II. He's heard their stories, shared their meals, and learned about their struggles both during and after service. Brooks nodded, his eyes sincere. I've learned that a badge doesn't make you right. It gives you responsibility. Responsibility to serve everyone equally, to look past your prejudices, to see the real person in front of you. The presentation continued with Brooks sharing specific examples. He talked about spending time with Mr. Johnson, a Black Korean War veteran who couldn't get served at restaurants while in uniform. He described learning from Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband earned a Bronze Star in Vietnam but faced discrimination in their hometown. In the back of the room, Mary Thompson wiped away tears as Brooks recounted her husband's story. Her cookies, once treated as suspicious evidence, had become a symbol of healing and connection at these training sessions. Chief Williams stood up next, holding a thick folder. "The results speak for themselves," he announced. "In 3 months, since implementing the Richardson Protocol, our community complaints have dropped by 40%. Officer engagement ratings have improved significantly." But the most powerful moment came when Brooks shared his personal transformation. "Last week, I pulled over a young black man in an expensive car," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this time, instead of making assumptions, I approached with respect. Turns out he was a Marine veteran who'd just returned from overseas." James stepped forward. "The goal isn't to make anyone feel guilty about the past. It's to create a better future. Every officer in this room has the power to either build trust or break it." Captain Martinez added her perspective. "This program isn't just about race relations or veteran awareness. It's about seeing the whole person, their story, their service, their humanity." The training session concluded with a new tradition. Mary's cookies were shared around the room as officers broke into small groups to discuss what they'd learned. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always productive. Sarah Chen interviewed several participants afterward. "It's not just sensitivity training," one officer told her. "It's about really understanding the community we serve, learning their stories, their struggles, their triumphs." As the room slowly emptied, Brooks approached James. "Colonel," he said, standing straight, "I never properly apologized that night. I was too shocked, too ashamed." James placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Your actions speak louder than any apology," he replied. "You've turned a moment of prejudice into a movement for change. That's worth more than any words." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Officers from different departments exchanged contact information, planning to implement the program in their own cities. What had started as one tense night in a quiet suburb was spreading, creating ripples of change across the nation's law enforcement community. The Richardson Protocol was no longer just a program, it was becoming a movement. One cookie, one story, one changed mind at a time. 6 months after that fateful night, the story of Colonel James Richardson and Officer Michael Brooks had become more than just a viral moment. It had sparked real change across the nation. The small Veterans Support Center, once a quiet refuge, was now a landmark for police reform and community healing. On a crisp autumn morning, similar to the evening when it all began, James stood before a much larger audience. The governor had come to present him with the State Medal of Merit, but James felt the real achievement was sitting in the crowd before him. 50 police departments from across the country had now adopted the Richardson Protocol. Officer Brooks, no longer the subject of scandal but a symbol of transformation, sat in his dress uniform beside Mary Thompson, whose cookies had become famous far beyond their community. "When I was a young airman," James began his speech, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "I dreamed of changing the world through service. Today, I see that change happening in ways I never expected." He gestured to the diverse crowd before him, police officers, veterans, community leaders, and citizens, all united in purpose. Sarah Chen, now working for a national news network, recorded as Brooks stood to share the latest statistics. In departments that have implemented the Richardson Protocol, community complaints have dropped by 60%. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," he added, his voice strong with conviction. "The real change is in how we see each other, how we serve our communities." The program had evolved beyond its original scope. What started as sensitivity training had become a comprehensive community engagement initiative. Veterans shared their stories at police academies. Officers spent time volunteering at veterans centers. Bridges were being built, one conversation at a time. Catherine Richardson watched proudly as her husband received the medal. Their grandson Tommy, now accepted into the Air Force Academy, sat beside her in his ROTC uniform. The legacy would continue through a new generation. "But our work isn't finished," James continued, adjusting his medal. "Just last week, Officer Brooks trained his 100th police department. Mary's cookies have been shared in training rooms across 20 states. This brought gentle laughter from the crowd. But more importantly, minds and hearts are changing." Chief Williams stepped forward with a surprise announcement. The police training academy is being renamed the Richardson Institute for Community Policing, he declared, unveiling a new plaque. Colonel Richardson's approach to turning conflict into connection will guide future generations of officers. Brooks, who now headed the training program, shared a recent success story. Last month, an officer in Chicago recognized a homeless man as a veteran because of our training. Instead of writing a ticket, she connected him with Veterans Services. He's now off the streets and helping other vets. His voice cracked slightly. That's the Richardson effect. Mary Thompson, her eyes bright with tears, stood to announce her own contribution. I'm publishing a cookbook, she said softly. All proceeds will fund scholarships for children of veterans to study criminal justice or social work. We're calling it Cookies for Change. The ceremony concluded with a powerful symbol of transformation. The spot where James had been wrongfully detained 6 months ago was now marked with a community garden. Officers and veterans would tend it together, growing vegetables for local food banks. The garden teaches us something important, James reflected, looking at the flourishing plants. Growth requires both rain and sunshine. Sometimes, the most beautiful things grow from difficult moments. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah Chen captured one final poignant scene. Officer Brooks, now a regular at the Veterans Support Center, sat sharing cookies with a group of rookie officers and elderly veterans. Their laughter and earnest conversation embodied everything the Richardson Protocol stood for. James and Catherine walked home together, just as they had done for 45 years. The same street that had witnessed humiliation now saw triumph. Neighbors waved, children played, and police patrol cars drove by with respectful nods. You know, James said to Catherine, when I was standing there that night, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Catherine squeezed his hand. You've always known how to find the light in darkness, James. That's why this worked. You showed others how to find it too. As the sun set on their quiet suburban street, the Richardson legacy was just beginning. In police academies, veterans centers, and community meetings across the nation, his story was becoming a blueprint for change. One man's dignity in the face of prejudice had sparked a movement that would impact generations to come. The Richardson Protocol was no longer just a program. It was becoming a movement, one cookie, one story, one changed mind at a time.